Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Dragon Prince Yuan Season 2 episode number 24 based on novel. So let's start. After leaving the Kangmang continent and arriving at the Tsangshuan sect, Zhu Yuan's view of the world had changed, and Xiao Qianxian no longer posed any threat in his eyes. Since the city lord wanted to resolve the grudge between the two of them, there was no reason for him to make a fuss. Xiao Qianxuan's lips moved, but did not say anything in the end, merely lifting his own cup and downing it in a single go. Following the closure of their grudge, the atmosphere immediately eased up, turning noisy and lively. Everyone present was a youngster, and had come a long way from home to this unfamiliar place. Hence, they soon warmed up to each other. Delicious dishes began to arrive one after another, and everyone could not help but begin to gorge themselves. Tunton was the most terrifying of the bunch, its mouth opening wide as it swallowed food several times larger than its body. Yao Yao was the most graceful, merely sampling some of the vegetables, no interest in any of the food that was too strong in flavor. As more and more food entered their stomachs, everyone's faces began to flush as boiling heat rose within them. They could feel searing Genesis chi flowing within their bodies, ultimately swiftly flooding into their chi dwellings. While everyone was happily digging in, laughter was heard. He, junior brother Zhu Yuan is so generous. Not many disciples will patronize the 100 Fragrances house at such a time. Zhu Yuan raised his head, and saw a young man standing to the side, a slight smile on his face as he watched them. It was the one who had spoken up for Zhu Yuan in Genesis Mountain, Xiao Xiu. Zhu Yuan had some good feelings towards the former, and immediately rose as he cupped his fists together. So it's senior brother Xiao Xiu. Disciples of the same status would differentiate their rank by age. Xiao Xiu was evidently older than Zhu Yuan. Zhu Yuan could tell that Xiao Xiu had something to say, and thus pointed beside him and said, "Want to come over and have a seat?" Xiao Xiu cheerfully consented, proceeding to sit down and chat with the rest for a while, before he finally looked towards Zhu Yuan and asked, "Junior brother Zhu Yuan, are you interested in joining us along with everyone else?" He did not beat about the bush, directly stating his objective. Shen Wanjin, Xiao Qianxian and the rest fell silent. There was not much surprise on Zhu Yuan's face, evidently having already guessed Xiao Xiu's aim. Xiao Xiu smiled and said, "Junior brother Zhu Yuan should know that the competition in the outer mountains is extremely fierce, and the many disciples here have already formed various factions and groups. Grouping up and watching each other's backs is after all better than fighting alone. Moreover, the Xingju disciples' advantage is too great. They are too powerful and any non-Xingju disciple will be suppressed by them." Xiao Xiao stared at Zhu Yuan as he slowly continued, "I've heard that there will only be 10 gold sash quotas in the upcoming peak selection ceremony, and the Xingju disciples have already declared that they will be taking them all, a truly overbearing declaration." Gold sash quotas. Zhu Yuan's brows knitted together slightly. Looks like junior brother Zhu Yuan has yet to hear of this. Xiao Xiu chuckled. "We are currently outer mountain disciples, and if we manage to enter the 7 peaks, we will become inner mountain disciples. These inner mountain disciples are also divided into different categories, from highest to the lowest, purple sash disciples, gold sash disciples and black sash disciples. The higher one's rank, the higher one's status in the 7 peaks. In addition, one will also be granted completely different cultivation resources. The top 10 performers of every peak selection ceremony will directly become gold sash disciples, by passing the black sash rank. Moreover, only the top 10 will be allowed to choose which peak to enter. The others will be allocated by the sect." At this point, Zhu Yuan and Yao Yao began to frown. They had come to the Tsangshuan sect to enter St. Genesis Peak, and obtain the second St. Rune Patriarch Kang Xian had sealed within it. If they ended up forcibly allocated to one of the other peaks, won't they be unable to achieve their goal? Zhu Yuan's eyes narrowed slightly. Looks like Yao Yao and him needed to each take one of the top 10 spots in the peak selection ceremony. As such, they would have to take them from the Xingju disciples, an act akin to taking food from a tiger. Seated at the table, Xiao Xiu smiled slightly as he looked at Zhu Yuan's expression and said, "I can see that junior brother Zhu Yuan is someone with ambition, and will not be satisfied with being the lowest rank black sash disciple when entering the 7 peaks." Tsangshuan sect disciples were strictly regulated by a ranking system, which aimed to motivate the disciples. A higher ranked disciple would not only enjoy high status, but also obtain more cultivation resources than the other disciples, cultivation resources that undoubtedly meant gaining a lead on others. Sometimes, it was as the saying went, once you're one step behind, you will always be that step behind. In fact, it may even result in you being forever being crushed under heel by others. Hence, there was no disciple who was willing to give up on their chance so easily during the peak selection ceremony. The group I'm in has 5 first-class disciples including myself. If we were to talk about strength, our group is one of the stronger ones amongst the non-Xingju disciple factions. Xiao Xiu fervently looked at Zhu Yuan and Yao Yao as he continued, if junior brother Zhu Yuan and senior sister Yao Yao join us, we will be able to attract even more disciples to our group. When that happens, we will not lose out even to the Xingju factions. He then looked towards Shen Wanjin and the rest as he said, when that time comes, the other Kangmang disciples can also join us. However, Shen Wanjin, Xiao Qianxian and the rest did not speak. They merely looked towards Zhu Yuan, clearly waiting for his decision. Zhu Yuan held an cup in silence for a while, before he slowly shook his head under Xiao Xiu's fervent gaze. I don't think I'll be able to join senior brother Xiao Xiu's group. He had still ended up rejecting Xiao Xiu's invitation, because he knew that though there was power in numbers, it also came with more disputes and troubles. Zhu Yuan's main objective in the Tsangshuan sect was to reach the divine dwelling stage as fast as possible. Only then would he truly possess the power to deal with the Great Wu Empire. Though the Great Wu Empire was currently doing all it could to stabilize the situation at its borders, once King Wu got his hands free, he would surely turn his eyes to the Great Zhu Empire. Therefore, Zhu Yuan needed to step into the divine dwelling stage before that happened. He did not wish to waste any potential training time on the disputes and meaningless politics in groups such as these. Disappointment rose on Xiao Xiu's face in response to Zhu Yuan's rejection. The former was not angry however, only feeling that it was such a pity. Although I cannot join your group, I am willing to become friends with senior brother Xiao Xie. If we have any needs in the future, we can always help each other. Zhu Yuan smiled. He did not want to tangle himself in the matters of a group, but he was willing to be friends with Xiao Xiu. The latter's character was pretty good, and quite to Zhu Yuan's liking. Xiao Xiu also smiled when he heard this and candidly said, that's exactly what I'm looking for. He did not try to persuade or force Zhu Yuan, because he was confident in his judgment. Zhu Yuan might seem as if he had just reached the first layer alpha origin stage, but Xiao Xiu had the feeling that the latter was not as simple as he appeared on the surface. Although junior brother Zhu Yuan is not joining us, the others can still join us if they are interested. Xiao Xiu indicated towards Shen Wanjin and the rest with a grin. Shen Wanjin and the rest were all third-class disciples, and Xiao Xiu was naturally not interested in their strength. However, he was a person with values and since he knew that these were Zhu Yuan's friends, he would give Zhu Yuan some face and allow them to join. Shen Wanjin and the rest were definitely tempted. After all, they clearly understood their current situation as outer mountain disciples. Ordinary third-class disciples that did not have any faction behind them would only face bullying everywhere. Although Zhu Yuan had shocked and awed everyone today, they naturally hoped to make more friends that would be able to help them. However, they did not nod but instead looked towards Zhu Yuan. Upon seeing this, Zhu Yuan smiled and nodded. It just so happened that he intended to concentrate on his cultivation, and was afraid that he may not be able to take care of everyone all the time. With Xiao Xiu's help, he would not have to worry about this. Zhu Yuan lifted his cup and said, I am thankful to senior brother Xiao Xiu. Xiao Xiu chuckled, knowing that Zhu Yuan was showing that he owed the former. Since both of them were now much closer, Xiao Xiu could not help but ask, right, junior brother Zhu Yuan? I'm dying to know since you brought back so much alpha origin on your first try. How many Genesis Chi stars did you create? Shen Wanjin and the rest also opened their ears, evidently equally curious. Zhu Yuan laughed and lifted his cup, downing in a single gulp, before he answered, only about 100. A series of gasps sounded around the tablet, Shen Wanjin and the rest dumbstruck. They were also first-layer alpha origin practitioners, but the number of Genesis Chi stars in their Chi dwellings only numbered slightly over 30. Xiao Xiu also opened and closed his mouth. In the end, he let out a bitter chuckle. Let alone Shen Wanjin and the rest, even a third-layer alpha origin like himself only had 100 or so stars. In other words, if they were to compete purely based on amount of Genesis Chi, a third-layer alpha origin like himself may not be able to beat Zhu Yuan. This caused to sigh deeply. He was truly unable to comprehend how Zhu Yuan's Genesis Qi had reached such a level. However, this also made Xiao Xue rejoice. It seems that his judgment was right after all. The young man before him was indeed extraordinary. Though the latter currently did not have much of a reputation, Xiao Xue had a premonition that there would be no one in the future Zhangshuan sect who would not know Zhu Yuan. The next day, early in the morning, Zhu Yuan was naturally not absent for the Genesis Mountain training. However, Yao Yao could not be bothered to go this time, merely throwing Tunton to him and telling him to put it on her cultivation platform. Thus, a strange sight could be seen on Genesis Mountain today. A little creature lay on Yao Yao's cultivation platform, its mouth wide open as it ate the surging Genesis Qi, a sight that made numerous disciples could not help but envy. After the Genesis Mountain training, Zhu Yuan carried Tunton down the mountain, heading straight for the Hidden Scriptures house. He had been itching to visit this place ever since yesterday. The Hidden Scriptures house was a majestic ancient-looking building that stood at the peak of one of the towering mountains. From the seemingly unending stream of disciples flying towards it, one could see that this place was undoubtedly one of the most popular locations in the outer mountains. The Hidden Scriptures house was extremely enormous, and was divided into 3 levels. Black-tier Genesis techniques were stored on the first level, Little Heaven on the second, and it was said that the third held True Heaven tier techniques. However, the rental fee was extremely high, and current disciples could not possibly afford them. Hence, Zhu Yuan made a beeline to the second level. A Little Heaven Genesis technique was more than attractive enough to his current self. There were very few disciples on the second level, because although the Little Heaven Genesis techniques here were powerful, they were even more difficult to learn. Everyone currently did not have many Genesis jade pieces at hand, and thus did not want to waste them, planning instead to visit later, when they had accumulated enough. The second level looked even better than the first, numerous jade strips hovering above white jade displays. Light shined from these jade strips, forming numerous words in the air in front of them. There's so many. Zhu Yuan was stunned by this sight. He estimated that there were over 100 of them after a cursory glance. This number truly shocked him to the core. One must know that a Little Heaven tier technique would be cherished as one of the most prized possessions by the factions in the Kangman continent. And yet, they were now so common here. From this, one could see just how terrifying that Zhangshuan sect's foundations were. Zhu Yuan wet his lips, his gaze burning as he walked forward step by step, passing white jade platform after platform. Low-grade Little Heaven Genesis technique, earth-covering finger seal. Low-grade Little Heaven Genesis technique, sword heart dipper. Mid-grade Little Heaven Genesis technique, metal devil Genesis body. Zhu Yuan's gaze swept across the words in front of numerous jade strips, discovering that the Little Heaven Genesis techniques here had been meticulously categorized. According to his estimates, the Great Wind and Thunder technique he obtained in the Saint Remains domain would be classified as a mid-grade Little Heaven Genesis technique. What I need the most now is a movement-type Genesis technique, mumbled Zhu Yuan to himself. The Dragon Step technique he initially learnt was no longer enough, as it was after all only a black-tier technique. Hence, Zhu Yuan had been planning on finding a Little Heaven level movement technique. His feet continued its slow advance. After about half an incense stick of time, they finally came to a stop in front of a certain white jade display as Zhu Yuan's burning gaze stared at the ancient jade strip before him. Mid-grade Little Heaven Genesis technique, ethereal form. Make the body akin to an illusion, making it difficult to discern what is real, and impossible to catch like the clouds. Zhu Yuan's heart shook. Ethereal form was clearly out of the ordinary. Without any hesitation, he reached out to grab the jade strip. However, just as his fingers touched it, another fair hand suddenly appeared from the side, grabbing the other corner of the jade strip. Zhu Yuan was stunned. He turned his head, only to see a pair of bright eyes glaring at him. A closer look revealed that it was a young lady with a sexy body and eye-grabbing legs in red. Who could it be but Ji Yu Hongyi? Ji Yu Hongyi. Zhu Yuan was a little dazed for a time, as he gazed at the girl in red, who had also chosen the ethereal form technique. She was usually the focus of attention amongst the outer mountain disciples, and was not only blessed with good looks, but also superb talent. Most importantly, of course, it was said that she had some ties in the Zhangshuan sect, practically making her one of the most welcomed individuals in the eyes of the male outer mountain disciples. You're also choosing it? Then you can have it first. Although most of the Xingju disciples gave off an air of superiority, and were extremely arrogant, not much of it could be seen from Ji Hongi. It was as if there was no difference between the disciples in her eyes, which was also why Zhu Yuan voluntarily released his grip. Just because someone else had chosen a Genesis technique here did not mean that others no longer had any chance. Hence, Zhu Yuan did not mind giving way to a lady. Oh, how courteous. Ji Hongyu glanced at him, but did not accept Zhu Yuan's goodwill. She released her fingers and said, "Forget it, there's still a copy version." After speaking, she confidently turned around and left, leaving behind a slight fragrance as her fine black hair brushed past in front of Zhu Yuan. However, she suddenly stopped after 2 steps, slightly tilting her head backwards as her bright eyes looked towards Zhu Yuan. "But I advise you not to choose this Genesis technique." "Why?" Zhu Yuan frowned a little. Ji Hongi replied, "Because Zhu Feng is also practicing it." Zhu Yuan's frown deepened, his tone calm as he asked, "What does that have to do with me? Am I not allowed to learn any Genesis techniques he selects?" The corners of Ji Hongi's red lips rose slightly. No comment. One could tell that she was still harboring a tiny grudge from when Zhu Yuan had rejected her in front of everyone yesterday. Hence, she returned him the exact same words he had given her. Zhu Yuan watched her slender, graceful figure leave. As she strided forward with her long legs, every male disciple on the second level seemingly followed her. "Women are indeed good at holding grudges," mumbled Zhu Yuan to himself. However, he had no interest in Ji Hongi, and this did not care about her attitude. His gaze quickly turned towards the jade stripe before him, a satisfied smile forming on his lips as he reached out to take it. With the jade strip now in hand, some simple information flowed into his head: the cost of renting the jade strip. 5 Genesis jade pieces a day. Recorded within these jade strips was the detailed cultivation method and the experiences of numerous elders and seniors. Even so, it was exceedingly difficult to learn, requiring ordinary disciple would have to spend a tremendous amount of time. This would undoubtedly be a huge expenditure of Genesis jade. Therefore, majority of the disciples would seek out instructors in the hidden scriptures house after choosing a Genesis technique. These instructors would point them in the right direction, allowing them to more easily master the technique. So expensive. Zhu Yuan could not help but sigh. Though the 40 or so Genesis jade pieces might seem like a lot, they were really not enough. Zhu Yuan continued advancing with the jade strip, but stopped again after a few steps, his eyeballs nearly popping from their sockets as he stared at a jade strip that was now before him. 9 Dragons Cannon, high-grade Little Heaven Genesis technique. Transform one's Genesis chi into dragons, peerless and tyrannical. These short few words gave off a tyrannical aura, displaying the power of the technique. Zhu Yuan's heart trembled with desire, but his expression turned stiff when he saw the rental price. The 9 Dragons Cannon required 20 Genesis jade pieces a day, 4 times of the ethereal form technique. Damn it. Zhu Yuan could not help but curse through gritted teeth, ultimately making the painful decision to give up on it for the time being. He planned to first master ethereal form, gather enough Genesis jade, and then return to rent the 9 Dragons Cannon. Zhu Yuan forcibly pulled his gaze away from the jade strip, tightening his grip around the ethereal form jade strip, as he turned around and quickly walked off. He soon arrived at the counter and handed the jade strip to a middle-aged man behind it. The man picked up a jade booklet to record as he asked, "Pass me your disciple token." Also, the ethereal form technique costs 5 Genesis jade pieces a day. How many days do you plan on leasing it? Zhu Yuan pondered for a moment and answers, "I'll go with 5 days. He'll first see to what extent he can master the ethereal form technique in 5 days. The middle-aged manager nodded and said, "Are you intending to find a Genesis technique instructor that has learnt it already?" Zhu Yuan was silent for a brief moment before asking, "Do you have any recommendations?" Little Heaven Genesis techniques were rather difficult to comprehend, and it was easy to take the wrong path if one were to blindly grasp about on his own, causing even more time to be wasted. At times, having someone else's guidance would be a huge help. Therefore, if the conditions were right, Zhu Yuan naturally intended on finding an instructor to guide him. The middle-aged manager thought for a bit, retrieved a jade tile and handed it to Zhu Yuan. Most of the instructors here are inner mountain disciples from the 7 peaks, and there's currently only one of them who has learnt the ethereal form technique. The price of listening to his teachings is also 5 Genesis jade pieces per day. Zhu Yuan curiously received the jade tile and found a name inscribed on it. Zhu Yu. Without raising his head, The middle-aged manager continued, the practice halls are in the mountain behind the hidden scriptures house. You can go find them yourself. Remember to return the jade strip when the deadline comes, or it will be forcibly taken back together with a fine. Zhu Yuan cupped his fists together. He picked up the ethereal form jade strip and left the hidden scriptures house, heading towards the rear mountain. In the rear mountain, he saw several unique buildings where disciples were constantly entering and leaving, an exceptionally bustling sight. Zhu Yuan followed the directions, eventually arriving before a wide and spacious building. After confirming the instructor's name at the front door, he walked in. Behind the doors was an extremely spacious hall where a dozen or so figures were seated in a circle. At their center was a tall man, who was currently eloquently giving a lecture. Zhu Yuan's entrance interrupted the lecture, causing the dozen listening figure to turn their heads and look. The moment they saw Zhu Yuan, looks of amusement immediately emerged in their eyes. Zhu Yuan frowned slightly, because he had just seen a familiar figure amongst them. It was the one who had a quarrel with him due to Han Shan on Genesis Mountain, Zhu Feng. Jiyu Hongyi was also seated a few places from Zhu Feng. The corners of her red lips turned slightly downwards when she saw Zhu Yuan enter. As expected, this guy did not listen to her advice. The instructor seated in the center looked towards Zhu Yuan and nonchalantly asked, "Who are you?" He had a thin face and a stern expression in his eyes, while powerful Genesis Qi rippled around him. Outer Mountain Disciple, Zhu Yuan. Zhu Yuan's expression remained calm, as he cupped his fists together towards the man. His gaze swept towards Zhu Feng, before turning back to the inner mountain disciple called Zhu Yu. The two rather resembled each other, making him begin to realize why Jiyu Hongyi had warned him earlier. Zhu Yuan. Zhu Yu was taken aback, casting a glance at Zhu Feng as the latter nodded with an icy smile. The former had heard an exaggerated description of how arrogant this kid from a remote continent was from Zhu Feng earlier, but he never imagined that Zhu Yuan would actually come here and seek guidance from him. Zhu Yuan's expression was still unchanged as he said in a neither overbearing nor servile tone, "I've chosen the ethereal form technique, and have come here hoping to listen to the key points with regards to it. Here's 5 Genesis jade pieces." The inner mountain disciple, Zhu Yu, swept a nonchalant gaze at Zhu Yuan, as contempt faintly rose from the corners of his lips. "No need. The class is already full, and we won't be accepting anyone new for the time being." Zhu Feng was his younger brother, and since he had a dispute with Zhu Yuan, Zhu Feng naturally found Zhu Yuan a sore sight. Zhu Yu's words caused laughter to sound in the hall. Most of the disciples here were from the Xingzhou continent, and thus looked towards Zhu Yuan with mocking eyes. Zhu Yuan frowned slightly, evidently not expecting Zhu Yu to take things so far. Zhu Yuan slowly said, "Isn't senior brother Zhu Yu's actions a little against the rules?" A full class was clearly an excuse. "Oh? A mere outer mountain disciples thinks he has the right to talk to me about the rules." Zhu Yu's eyes narrowed slightly, a sneer appearing from the corners of his mouth. In the next moment, powerful Genesis Qi abruptly exploded from his body, forming an overwhelming pressure that loomed towards Zhu Yuan. Zhu Yu's strength had at the very least reached the 5-layer Alpha Origin stage, far surpassing everyone present. Hence, when the Genesis Qi pressure surged towards Zhu Yuan, his breathing turned a little ragged. Roar. However, just as Zhu Yu was about to force Zhu Yuan into a miserable state, the clothes at his area moved as Tunton stuck its head out and released a low roar from its throat. Tunton leaped out, landing in front of Zhu Yuan as its tiny body began to grow rapidly. In a short span of a few breaths, it turned into its battle form, savagery violently pulsing from it as Berserk Genesis Qi began to wreak havoc with a roar. Roar! The entire hall shook as Zhu Yu's Genesis Qi pressure was instantly ripped to shreds, causing him to force back several steps by Tunton's ferocity, as his face paled slightly. Zhu Yu's complexion was steely green with fear and anger as he sternly shouted, You dare to use a beast to hurt me." Zhu Yuan swept the former a cold look as he lightly caressed Tunton's head. After sweeping a glance at Zhu Yu, its body swiftly began to shrink. The hall was now a mess, Zhu Feng and the other disciples scurrying to the side as they looked towards Tunton in uncertainty. Only Jiyu Hongyi remained seated. Her red lips parted slightly as she said, "Senior brother Zhu Yu, your rejection is not in line with the rules. It will not be good for you either if the law enforcement group finds out." Zhu Yu looked at Jiyu Hongyi as a smile was revealed on his face. "Since junior sister Hongyi has spoken, I will naturally give face." Jiyu Hongyi's elder was one of the high-ranking members of the Tsangshuan sect, and Zhu Yu naturally did not dare to offend her. His gaze turned Zhu Yuan as he coldly snorted. You may stay on account of junior sister Hongi. However, no bastardly beasts are allowed in my hall, so you'll have to throw that bastard out before returning. However, Zhu Yuan merely glanced at the former coldly and said, can't even beat a beast, what can I learn by staying here? It will only be a waste of Genesis Jade. Contempt rose from the corners of his mouth, ignoring Zhu Yu's white, with rage complexion, as he turned around and left with Tunton in his arms. Zhu Yu's eyes darkened as he watched Zhu Yuan leave. Soon after, he let out a chilling chuckle. What an ignorant fool, go ahead with your arrogance, do you really think you'll be able to learn the ethereal form technique without my guidance? When you've squandered away all of your Genesis Jade, you'll still end up coming back to beg me. After leaving the rear mountain, Zhu Yuan's expression was still somewhat gloomy. He had not expected such a coincidence to occur. To think that the instructor he encountered would be Zhifeng's elder brother. Looks like Jiyu Hongi had meant well when she tried to warn him earlier. She was just a little too proud, and had not fully explained everything. I refuse to believe that I will be unable to learn the technique without an instructor. Zhu Yuan grasped the jade strip as his eyes hardened. It was indeed not a simple task to learn a little heaven Genesis technique, but he did not believe he would really be unable to learn it without any guidance. In the worst-case scenario, he would just have to waste a little more time. Even though he said so, Zhu Yu had really ruined his mood today. Zhu Yuan was in a slightly foul mood as he left the rear mountain and returned to his little house. On the balcony of the little house, Yao Yao lazily soaked in the warm rays of the sun as she casually flipped through an ancient book. Her perfect side-face view glowed like jade, while her fine black hair seemed to spill down, a sight so beautiful that it would shake anyone's heart. When Zhu Yuan saw this scene, the last traces of the bad mood he was in stealthily disappeared. Yao Yao seemed to sense something and tilted her head, as she inquired in a rather lazy tone, what is it? Zhu Yuan sat down beside her, breathing in the light fragrance of the young lady beside him as he somewhat helpless explained what had happened today. Yao Yao attentively listened, her bright eyes narrowing slightly, making it impossible for anyone to tell what she was feeling. Only after he was finished did she say in a clear voice, a mere inner mountain disciple will at best have an elementary mastery of the ethereal form technique. How can he possibly have the qualifications to master it completely? If you had chosen to stay, it would only have been a waste of Genesis Jade. Those Genesis Jade would be better off used to improve Tunton's meals. By the side, Tunton immediately barked in excitement when it heard this, its eyes shining brightly. You were pretty good today. I'll bring you to 100 Fragrances house later on. Zhu Yuan chuckled as he rubbed Tunton's herd. If not for this little thing, he would have barely been able to face Zhu Yu. Although the other party did not dare to do anything excessive, Zhu Yuan would likely have ended up in a pretty miserable state. Fortunately, Tunton has protected him, making Zhu Yu suffer instead. Show me the ethereal form technique. Yao Yao extended a hand, her seemingly sparkling fingers slim and long. Zhu Yuan retrieved the jade strip and passed it to Yao Yao. Yao Yao took it and slightly shut her eyes. A long while later, she slowly opened them and said, this Genesis technique is a little meaningful. Your judgment is not bad. Learning it is not difficult, it merely requires first unblocking 108 apertures in the body, before pouring in mist essence to temper them. At the advanced stage, one will be able to turn one's body ethereal like the mist, and travel 1,000 miles in an instant. However, the slightly more troublesome part is that there are millions and millions of apertures in the body, and their locations are different for everyone. Only by gradually trying to feel them would one be able to unblock the 108 apertures. I believe the so-called instructor will only be giving them some suggestions when the disciples are doing the sensing wrongly, and get them to restart the process, making him pretty much useless. A brief observation was all Yao Yao needed to understand the intricacies of the ethereal form technique. Such terrifying comprehensive ability stupefied Zhu Yuan a little. Zhu Yuan's eyes were practically glowing as he stared at Yao Yao and impatiently asked, does Big Sis Yao Yao know how to sense the 108 apertures? Yao Yao shook her head. I can't. However, she then extended a finger and pointed at Zhu Yuan. But you can. Zhu Yuan was utterly confused, evidently unable to understand what she meant by that. Yao Yao could not help but laugh at the sight of his lost appearance. She gently tapped the spot between Zhu Yuan's brows with a cold finger, where the ancient saint rune was hidden. You truly like someone who does not realize he lives on a treasure mountain. The saint rune between your brows was split off from the Tsangshuan saint stamp, and Patriarch Kang Xian has told us that it is called the decoder saint rune. It has the ability to see the vulnerabilities or weak points in any Genesis techniques. Not only the enemy's, but also your own. Zhu Yuan's eyes grew brighter and brighter as she spoke. He now understood the meaning behind Yaoero's earlier words, and slowly said, "So I can use the decoder saint rune to view the ethereal form technique." Yao Yao gave a slight nod as a lovely smile was revealed on her face. As such, there is no need for you to painstakingly feel out the aperture locations. You only need to use the decoder saint rune to find them. This will be multiple times more effective than others. So why would you need an elementary level inner mountain disciple's guidance? Zhu Yuan could not help but powerfully hammer his fists together. Even someone usually as calm as himself could not help but be overwhelmed by joy as he lunged towards Yao Yao. "Big sis Yao Yao, you're too awesome." Before his hands could touch Yao Yao, her slightly narrowed eyes swept towards him, causing him to freeze on the spot. Zhu Yuan awkwardly withdrew his hands, grasping the jade strip as he resentfully said, "I'll go try it out first and see if I can find the apertures in my body." After speaking, he slipped away to the rear courtyard to try out the ethereal form technique. A slight smile appeared on Yaoero's pretty face as she watched Zhu Yuan leave. Soon after, she looked outside their little house as her red lips pursed in a slightly chilling manner. "Tunton." She gently patted Tunton. Tunton raised its head. "Go teach that fellow a lesson," said an expressionless Yao Yao. Although she could bully Zhu Yuan, what right did a mere inner mountain disciple have? Tunton released a low roar upon hearing this, an excited look flooding out in its beady beast eyes. Its figure moved, transforming into flash of black light as it shot forth. Yao Yao watched Tunton disappear before she lay down once again, leisurely bathing in the sunshine, as she read the ancient book in her hands. Night descended. Zhu Yu walked out of his teaching hall to watch the disciples disperse. Their respectful farewells to him when they left made him feel increasingly pleased with himself inside. Behind Zhu Yu, Zhu Feng laughed and said, He, I have to thank elder brother for giving Zhu Yuan such a miserable time today. It was so refreshing." Zhu Yu smiled faintly. He's merely an ignorant country bumpkin from some tiny continent. Does he really believe that a little heaven Genesis technique will be so easy to learn? When he comes begging, watch how I'll humiliate him. I've also told the other Inner Mountain senior and junior brother disciples to make sure he won't find even a single instructor. I'll make it such that he'll be unable to learn even a single Genesis technique. Let's see what he'll have to. Zhu Feng also laughed icily and nodded. Zhu Yu said, head on back first, and work hard to master the ethereal form technique during the next few days such that you will have something to show for yourself in the peak selection ceremony. Zhu Feng acknowledged, turned around and left. After sending him off, Zhu Yu began to return to his dwelling. Inner Mountain disciples naturally received far better treatment than the Outer Mountain disciples, each one owning a good place to cultivate. Zhu Yu rose on his Genesis Chi, flying past a mountain when his expression suddenly changed, because a flash of black light was rapidly approaching him from below like a bolt of lightning. "Who?" roared Zhu Yu as the Genesis Chi in his body began to surge out. With a swing of his hand, Genesis Chi transformed into a giant hand that was dozens of feet wide, mercilessly swatting down at the black light. However, the black light showed no indications of stopping. A low roar seemed to be heard as sharp claws suffused with black light abruptly slashed downwards. In that instant, even space itself seemed to disintegrate. The giant Genesis Chi hand was ruptured in a mere few breaths as sharp claw winds continued on their path. A foul smell assaulted Zhu Yu's face, quickly followed by intense pain. He could not help but scream. A bloody claw appeared in front of his face, slashing all the way to his waist as his clothes were torn to shreds, making him an extremely miserable sight to see. Fresh blood dripped down his eyes, causing Zhu Yu to explode with anger. Genesis Chi madly burst out, but before he could counterattack, the black light had already disappeared into the boundless night sky. Zhu Yu blankly stared at his surroundings in the air as his body trembled uncontrollably. He was no fool. How could he not know that the black light was definitely related to Zhu Yuan? In fact, it may even be the little bastardly beast from earlier today. But so what if he knew? Could he say that he was brought to such a state by an Outer Mountain disciple? What face would he have if this spread back to the 7 peaks? Thus, Zhu Yu burst into rage. Zhu Yuan. I will make sure you're unable to learn even a single Genesis technique. In the night, Zhu Yu's furious and bitter howl rang out like a wild beast's. A creek flowed in the mountain, making clear sounds as water beat against the rock. Zhu Yuan's figure was seated on a rock by the creek with his eyes faintly shut. At this moment, his breathing seemed to become extremely weak. The Genesis chi in his body slowly began to flow in his channels according to the instructions in the ethereal form technique. The crux of this technique was to unblock a 108 apertures, and at this point in time, Zhu Yuan was going to find the location of the first aperture. This was something he had to do by himself, because even though he possessed the decoder Saint rune that could view the weak points of any Genesis technique, he needed to first give it somewhere to start. Without the first aperture as a primer of sorts, how could the decoder Saint rune find the second aperture? The Genesis chi in his body circulated in his channels time and time again, an exceedingly boring process. However, Zhu Yuan's heart was akin to a still lake as he concentrated on sensing any strange disturbances in the Genesis chi flow. Half a day passed in this manner. Only now did Zhu Yuan understand how troublesome it was to practice the ethereal form method. He had already used slightly over half a day for the first aperture alone. It was difficult to imagine how long it would take if he were to find and unblock even more apertures by himself. Fortunately, on the 300th round along the route indicated by the ethereal form technique, Zhu Yuan finally sensed a tiny disturbance. The instant this tiny disturbance appeared, the long-waiting Zhu Yuan immediately turned his Genesis chi, directing its full force towards the origin of the disturbance. A faint prickling pain was felt as Zhu Yuan felt an aperture open in his body. The moment this happened, the Genesis chi flowing through the route given by the ethereal form technique began to flow in little by little. A certain subtle sensation rose that allowed Zhu Yuan understand that he had found the first aperture and unblocked it. Next, I'll have to smoothen the aperture with Genesis chi before infusing it with mist essence. Zhu Yuan breathed an almost inaudible sigh of relief before he once again began to circulate his Genesis chi, wisp after wisp flowing into the aperture that began to smoothen it according to a unique method. Inside the aperture, sliver after sliver of Genesis chi gathered, seemingly transforming into a rolling wheel that soon started to spin at a unique frequency as it smoothed the aperture. This smoothing method was the essence of the ethereal form technique. Only by using this procedure would the mist essence be able to fuse with the aperture later on. Zhu Yuan very carefully manipulated his Genesis chi as he continued to smoothen the aperture. In the beginning, his control was rather rough and unpracticed, but gradually grew more and more polished as time passed, allowing the smoothing process to become much quicker. Hence, after about 4 hours, the aperture felt smooth and round. The process was done. With a slight grin on his face, Zhu Yuan gave a light tap to his universe bag, causing a transparent jade bottle to appear in his hand. Inside the bottle, a milky white mist swirled. The mist within this bottle was the so-called mist essence. Mist essence was formed from the agglomeration of Genesis chi and the clouds when the sun and moon interchanged. It was a rather bizarre, but seemingly magical process. Of course, Zhu Yuan had not collected it himself, but had bought it with Genesis jade in the glittering jewels pavilion. A single bottom of mist essence had cost him 2 pieces of Genesis jade. It should be enough for 3 days, mumbled Zhu Yuan to himself. With a thought, wisps of mist began rising from the bottle, transforming into white smoke that flowed in through Zhu Yuan's nose. Once the mist essence was in his body, Zhu Yuan began directing it through his channels. There was not much Genesis chi contained within the mist essence, making it very easily absorbed or dispersed by the Genesis chi in his body. Hence, Zhu Yuan needed to guard it with his full attention, as he sent sliver after sliver into the aperture he had smoothed earlier. Mist essence flowed into the aperture, drifting about as it stealthily fused into it. As mist essence continued to be infused, Zhu Yuan began to feel a very faint sensation spreading from the aperture, seemingly akin to the ungraspable mist. This went on for another 2 hours. Zhu Yuan suddenly opened his eyes, faint mists seemingly swirling within them, before scattering completely a moment later. Joy appeared on his face. He had finally completed the first of the 108 apertures of the ethereal form technique. He lifted his head to look at the sky, discovering that the first aperture had taken him nearly an entire day. At this rate, it would take nearly a month to complete the first level of the ethereal form technique. There were 3 levels to the ethereal form technique. only by unblocking a set of 36 apertures would one reach the next level. Thankfully, I have the decoder Saint rune. Zhu Yuan grinned slightly. Now that the first aperture was done, he could use the decoder Saint rune to find the location of the second one. As such, he would be able to cut out the most troublesome sensing process. At this point, Zhu Yuan sent out a thought without any hesitation, and the faint ancient Saint rune between his brows began to descend, fusing into the deepest recesses of his eyes. Decoder Saint rune. The Genesis chi in his body began to follow the path indicated in the ethereal form technique again, while Zhu Yuan's pupils seemed to pierce through his body, focusing on the location of the first aperture. Its strange yet wonderful ripple seemed to pulse. It was the power of the decoder Saint rune. The ripple spread, and a few minutes later, Zhu Yuan's heart violently shook when he saw a strange ripple suddenly pulse from a certain location in his body. There was no hesitation whatsoever as Genesis charged towards it. The familiar prickling pain was felt as another aperture was opened. The instant it opened, Zhu Yuan sensed a thin thread of Genesis chi extended from the first aperture, linking up with the new aperture and establishing a connection. This phenomenon clearly showed that this was the correct location of the second aperture. Zhu Yuan's eyes opened as they rapidly filled with elation. Sensing the first aperture had taken a good half of the day, but with the power of the decoder Saint rune, he had drastically shortened the time required. Moreover, the subsequent apertures would only become harder and harder to sense, but this was clearly not going to be a problem for him. The decoder Saint rune is just too awesome, said Zhu Yuan. Only now did he fully realize how miraculous its power was. With it, he would be able to more efficiently master any Genesis technique he desired, making him far more efficient than others. A fire began to burn in Zhu Yuan's eyes as he softly chuckled. Zhu Yu, I'll show you that even without your guidance, I will still be able to master the ethereal form technique. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes again, and began to polish the smoothen the second aperture. The decoder Saint rune could find the aperture locations, but he would still have complete the subsequent processes himself. Hence, besides being present for the Genesis Mountain training, all of Zhu Yuan's time, during the next 3 days, was invested into the ethereal form technique. As he tirelessly continued to work, a total of 18 of the 108 apertures were unblocked by him in 3 short days. The first level of the ethereal form technique was fast approaching. However, while Zhu Yuan was immersed in his training, waves were churning in the outer mountains, causing many disciples to be shocked. The origin of these waves was to everyone's surprise, the instructors from the rear mountain of the Hidden Scriptures house. These instructors had high status in the outer mountains due to 2 main reasons. Firstly, they were inner mountain disciples. Secondly, they guided the other disciples in learning Genesis techniques. However, several instructors secretly spread that Zhu Yuan would be restricted from attending the lectures for the Genesis techniques they were in charge of. This news caused quite an uproar, numerous disciples feeling pity towards Zhu Yuan. No one had expected him to have stirred up these instructors this time. With regards to such matters, the outer mountain manager Chen Yuan should have stepped up to put a stop to it. However, he seemed to be ignoring it, causing it to become an extremely hot topic in the outer mountains. I heard that Zhu Yuan angered Zhu Yu. Zhu Yu is after all an inner mountain disciples, and has many friends. The other instructors would naturally not risk offending, hence why they've declared that they won't be teaching Zhu Yuan any Genesis techniques. Zhu Yuan is really too arrogant. To think that he even dares to offend senior brother Zhu Yu. Yeah, without the guidance of the instructors, what can Zhu Yuan possibly learn by himself? If this continues, he won't be able to perform well in the peak selection ceremony 3 months later. He deserves it. Let's see what he can do now that is being shut out by all the instructors. Similar whispers spread to every corner of the outer mountains, an indication that the number of gloating people were not few. After all, there were many people who were envious of Zhu Yuan's first-class disciple status. Hidden Scriptures House, Rear Mountain. In a certain hall, Zhu Yu stood with his hands behind his back, while Ji Yu Hongyi, Zhu Feng and the rest of the disciples were seated on mats in front of him, their eyes closed as they tried to sense for apertures. All of a sudden, Ji Yu Hongyi opened her eyes, happiness flashing across her lovely face as she exclaimed, "I found my 6th aperture." The others also opened their eyes, their envious gazes looking towards her. The scars on Zhu Yu's face had yet to fully heal. He smiled and nodded. "There's no need for the rest of you to be envious. Ji Yu Hongyi's talent is better than yours, so her progress is not surprising." The other disciples respectful said with a smile, well, it's still thanks to senior brother Zhu Yu's guidance. Ji Hongyu hesitated slightly, before she too cupped her fists together towards Zhu Yu, showing her gratitude. Zhu Yu seemed to nonchalantly wave his hand, but the pleased look that faintly rose from the corners of his mouth was a little difficult to hide. With his hands behind his back, he raised his gaze and peered into the distance as an icy smile suddenly appeared on his face. He wondered how many apertures Zhu Yuan had managed to unblock. It was likely that he had yet to even reach that point, right? Zhu Yuan, you must be regretting it now that there's no one to teach you, right? But even if you go down on your knees and beg me now, I will never teach you. Since you've offended me, I'll let you know the meaning of eternal despair. This video will end here.